Enemy set to lava!
Welcome to General Quarters. My name is Jim Maughan. I'm with the Lepanto Institute. Today's show is going to be a very interesting one. We are fortunate enough to have with us Dr. Elise Rose. We're going to talk about climate change and the Great Reset, or as I like to call it, the Great Marxist Reset. So, Elise, why don't you join us and say hi to the folks at Lepanto Institute?
Hi, everybody.
It's great to have you here. Elise, if we're real quick for everybody here, I'm just going to go through actually your fairly impressive credentials. And so Dr. Rose earned her doctorate in agronomy at Kansas State University, her Master of Arts in teaching from Howard University, and her Bachelor of Science from Georgetown University. She's a former adjunct professor of biology as well as director of tutoring at Ave Maria University. Dr. Rose has taught classes in microbiology, introductory biology, laboratory and lectures, and animal biology at the college level. She has done research for the United States EPA, NASA, the Department of Energy, and the Wisconsin State Department of Agriculture. She's also was on the White House Committee on Science and Technology Policy under Ronald Reagan, and she wrote the final report on nuclear war and crops for that. She's also studied natural ecosystems and carbon dioxide. Doctor, welcome, and it's great to have you here.
Hi.
So, Dr. Rose, a couple things if I could. Let's start out with, if we could, it just seems to me that this climate change issue has been, for lack of a better word, it's almost the de facto truth now, where you hear news reporters just presume and say things in a assumption that this is actually science, and the fact that fossil fuel emissions are causing drastic climate change. And the narrative is in my view, is meant to terrify people. Can you do us a favor and start out with how this issue is presented to the public, and frankly, why you think it's wrong?
Okay, I'll start with the data, because as a scientist, that's where we always should start. We should not start with a theory and then find data or manufacture data to fit the theory. We should start with data and then compose a theory that fits that data. The truth is, if you look at the temperature for the last 2,000 years, we are not even one standard deviation above the mean. In fact, we're very close to the average temperature for the last 2,000 years.
Okay.
Not anywhere. There was a time when the Earth was much warmer, long time ago, like, millions of years ago, when the dinosaurs were in the Earth was a lot warmer. But even in recorded history, there was a medieval warming period when the Vikings went to Greenland, and you could grow grapes there. They called it Vinland or Vineland. And the medieval warming period was a period where agricultural production was very high because of warmer temperatures. Warm temperatures actually are good for agriculture in most of the world. So that even if we were experiencing global warming, it wouldn't be bad. It would be good, as it was in the medieval warming period. But we are also not nearly as cold as the coldest time in so-called modern history, which was the Little Ice Age, which was in the 17th and 18th centuries, and it was considerably colder then. All of this was pre-industrial revolution. So these changes in the climate have nothing to do with man. As a matter of fact, the climate is constantly changing. It's not a static system. It's not a box and there is no Edenic time when the climate was perfect and we have to go back to that. No. The climate is constantly changing, has been since the Earth was formed 4 billion years ago, and since human beings arose, it's changed many times, since even if we don't go back as far as the dinosaurs. And we can see that there are fluctuations in temperature some of this is weather, not climate. I mean, this happens, we have a weather event like they had in Texas this year. That's not a climate change. That
Right.
was a weather event. And it was not evidence of a climate change that happened. That was a once in a century type, or maybe once or twice in a century type of event. It's still, that does not make it mean that the climate changed. It means it was exceptionally cold. Certainly was not evidence of global warming. Even, the average person knows that when it gets a lot colder than it usually is, that's not evidence of global warming. They'll try to convince you that you're not smart enough to figure that out, but that's actually true.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about like how do you
They
present data that way? In other words, how do you prove this? For example, you were telling me about the ice samples.
Oh, yes, that actually is evidence of the one change that has happened in my lifetime, and it's not temperature, it's carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide concentrations have increased uh, about a little bit in my lifetime. Maybe they started at 325 parts per million, and now they're maybe close to 400 parts per million. So, but what they do is they take a rod and they take it's called a core sample. We do this when we're sampling soils. Also, you take it's basically a cylinder you put down in the ice of the Arctic, and there are layers of ice, and each layer represents a year of snow that was compacted into ice. But air bubbles get trapped in there. So they have about 50,000 years of record in there of the air, what the air was like. And they found that in the last 50,000 years, there has been a lot of change in the carbon dioxide concentration. It was down as low as 100 parts per million within that last 50,000 years. It was also a lot higher than it is now, over 500 parts per million, with no intervention by man.
And that was that was absent of combustion engines and fossil fuel
Right,
emissions.
right. I mean, he's really only since the 20th century. If you want to consider the Industrial Revolution, uh, maybe you can consider the 19th century as well. But there really hasn't been anthropogenic change, meaning man-made change, um, in anything since, except for maybe the last 200 years. We have temperature records for the last 150 to 200 years. However, the people who want to believe in, we should absolutely say that global warming or climate change is a religion, because they don't have data to support their side of it. They believe this as a way of feeling significant or important, a way of feeling like, oh, they can do something good by changing this, like,
Sure.
and feel guilty for doing bad things like pollution.
If we could, I'd like to pick that up towards the end because I think that's a very
But
compelling
but
discussion.
anyway, they have gone back and changed. They're now altering previous temperature records to fit their theory rather than accepting the data. They now say, oh no, we know that this data was wrong because it doesn't fit our theory. So
That's
they're
from a science standpoint, that's heresy.
very scary, very scary.
Yeah.
It means you have nothing to hang on to.
Yes.
But these are people who don't recognize that there are only two genders. So,
Valid point.
so
Can I go back to the core samples for a second? So it would seem to me
yes.
that alone would be some fairly compelling evidence. If you can capture an air sample that's trapped in the ice from 50,000 years ago, it's a pretty safe bet, given we know the half-life of carbon, right?
Mhm.
That it's a pretty safe bet that you can come up with a pretty good understanding of what the carbon emissions in the atmosphere was. I mean, isn't that pretty foolproof?
Uh, yeah, I would say that there might be people who would dispute the method. That's not the same as carbon dating. That's measuring the carbon dioxide concentration of a sample, there and there. I don't want to get too
Did I
technical.
get ahead of my skis there?
You can look at carbon 12 versus carbon 13 proportions in things. That's another method of dating. That's how sometimes they use to date to figure out if
Okay, we can kind of
the
like,
painting is a forgery. They use that method, but this is just looking at the samples. Yes, I trust that method. It's considered more reliable than tree ring sampling.
oh, okay.
It goes back a lot farther because we don't have tree ring samples from 50,000 years ago. Well, they might have some fossils. We do have fossil record, of some things, but
Sure, sure. So
anyway.
this is very interesting. So the point
But
is
that
that,
that tells us about carbon dioxide. And what is interesting is, unlike Al Gore's contention that carbon dioxide will cause a rise in temperature, what we find from things like that is that carbon dioxide follows a rise. A rise in carbon dioxide follows a rise in temperature. It's a lagging indicator because
okay,
we have carbon dioxide is produced by either two things: combustion of fuels or respiration of animals and
and
uh,
plants.
plants respire, but they recapture their own um, carbon dioxide and use it for photosynthesis. That's another thing about carbon dioxide. It does not stay the same if we produce it by either combustion or respiration. It's caught up by plants in photosynthesis. Almost all the photosynthesis on Earth happens in the ocean because the ocean covers, 2/3 of the Earth, and in algae of the ocean. So what happens when a little alga cell captures carbon dioxide, does photosynthesis, makes sugar and other components out of that carbon that's in there? It grows, gets bigger, does more photosynthesis, captures more carbon dioxide. So putting more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is not a static event.
Right, right.
It can be captured again. People who believe in the Gaia hypothesis believe the Earth will keep itself stable, and this is one of the ways in which the Earth does. And that the the plants in the ocean don't have enough carbon dioxide. It's a limiting factor for them, so they actually will be happy to take it up and make more little algae.
Sure.
But
So as a scientist, this has got to be sort of enraging to you because they've hijacked the narrative with false data. Is that fair?
yes, and they assume that you will not know that we are not one standard deviation above the mean. And a lot of these people, the reporters, politicians, and Hollywood people who talk about this, they don't even know what I'm saying when I say one standard deviation above the mean. That means that 67% of the data will fall within that average temperature, and we're not outside that 67%. You would have to go way farther out to be considered scientifically significant. But
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Because I,
and,
and
so,
uh,
but it's presented as a fact, and it's a theory without data to support it. And we should not be making public policy. We should not be teaching our children based on something that is basically a religious belief. When you don't have facts to support it, and you're just saying this is happening, this is your belief in it's a fantasy.
wow, that's well said. And so let's go to the next part. You were alluding to this earlier. This literally has turned into a religion because in spite like, and here's what I'll say about this, and if I could bear with me. So I've always been the type of person to recognize that I think Western civilization, for example, is the greatest civilization ever because of the marriage of faith and reason, right? So
Mhm.
when you divorce faith and reason, you only have faith. That leads to fundamentalism, that leads to
Right.
extremism. And when you only have reason, it leads to utilitarianism, nihilism, all that stuff, right?
Right.
This is interesting because they claim to be science when in actuality, the data doesn't support it. In fact, many would argue that it's absolutely false. So it's actually they are involved only in faith but they claim to be science. It's doubly diabolical.
Yes, yes. And just as in the abortion field, they're actually anti-science. They don't want data. This is why they're scrubbing the ancient temperature data. They don't want the data to come out in there because it would contradict their theory. And they're searching for meaning in their lives, because absent of religion, they need something to make them feel meaningful. And so they've glommed onto this. And the people, the very powerful who push this, people like George Soros and Bill Gates, they are using fear of the average person. The average person can be hyped up by fear. We saw this with the COVID epidemic and pandemic,
Sure.
that they used that people's fear to control people, to literally lock people in their houses, and to take away a lot of freedoms. The pernicious thing about the climate hoax is that it could be used to affect so many aspects of our lives, from transportation, trying to make us use electric cars, which is ridiculous, because does the electricity come from? Unless you live in France and are on a nuclear electricity grid, it comes from coal. You have
Yes.
to burn coal to make that electricity. So you're not avoiding the use of fossil fuels. You're just making it more expensive by adding a step.
Let me. That's a great point, because this really speaks to this entire conversation. So when you take the fact that electric cars are powered by coal, number one, number two, in order, due to their own regulation, to get rid of the batteries of that car, right? When it's over with, the net gain is barely negligible. Isn't that correct?
And in order to make the batteries, you have to use all kinds of rare earth metals and things which are unsustainably mined. They use slave and child labor.
Wow.
It's an ecological disaster. Another thing which I would like to say is some of this is misdirection. So we don't look at there are actual environmental harm being done. For instance, contraceptives in the water have changed.
Yes.
The water pollution is real. My last scientific work was about water pollution, actually about nitrate pollution from manure. But there is so much contamination of the water. You never hear about that. You hear about global warming. Why? Because water is much, people can have more local control over that. But you talk about the climate, that's the whole world. So they can control the whole world. They can control your transportation. I mean, they try to, limit your freedom in various ways.
Yes.
But
Yes.
it always makes certain people more powerful. And the most dangerous thing I've heard about recently is that Bill Gates has decided that he is going to alter the climate himself by putting crystals in the stratosphere so that they cannot be brought down by rain, and that will reflect sunlight and lower the temperature. So he would dim the planet and lower temperature. This is disaster for northern agriculture.
That's insane.
All of the northern tier of U.S. states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, the Dakotas, Montana, the fruit growing areas of Pacific Northwest, all of Europe. Europe is quite far north. I mean,
yes,
here is north of Montreal. People don't realize that, but most of Europe is quite north of the United States. And to lower their light and lower their temperature, they depend on those long hours of sunlight in the summer. And if you dim the solar impact, that's going to reduce agriculture. Russia would be devastated by this.
Great point. Anyone has ever been to those cities you were talking about in the summertime will know that the sun doesn't go down till very late.
Right, but that has impact on agriculture. Not to mention, I'm sure that's what I know about. I know the most about. So I'm sure that it would have impact in other areas too. I am satisfied with the temperature that the globe is now. I am not wishing it to be reduced, even though I live in Florida. I think that for him to do this is a so arrogant. It's
and
oh
reckless
God.
and arrogant. That's I'd like to discuss that next
He
because
does
that's a
that
real big part of this discussion, and it goes like this: the call it the global elite. These guys like Soros and Bill Gates and all of these guys, they have a vision, and that vision is centered squarely around population control, and
Yes.
they wish to reduce the population of the Earth. And by his own words, we have 7 billion roughly now. He wants to bring it down to 1 billion, my view, of perfect people, right? So it
Right.
all, and then the next part of
Very,
it, go. I'm sorry.
very dangerous from like 20 points of view. There's so much wrong with that.
Yeah.
Going from the individual woman that they want to pump with hormones from age 15 to age 45.
Yep.
3 years of steroid hormones, not good. We don't want our male athletes taking same hormones. We should not want our girls and women taking hormones. This is not good. This is systemic hormone. It has all kinds of effects to keep people on that. All right. Demographic winter. They're experiencing this in Europe and Japan now. It means that you have an aging population. You don't have enough young people being born, not enough babies being born to replace the population to support, particularly in areas with high social welfare like Europe, US, or Japan.
Well, it's a big problem.
You don't have enough young people. Number three, as an agronomist, I can tell you the earth can support at least 10 million people.
10 billion.
10 billion. 10
Yeah.
billion. Yes, yes. We are at 7 now. The problem is unequal distribution of freedom. The places where are people starving these days? Two that come to mind are North Korea and
Right.
Venezuela.
Right.
And what happened in those two places? They're totalitarian socialist or communist places with people have zero freedom.
Well said. Venezuela was the richest country in South and Central America,
Yes.
and they literally turned that place into a dumpster fire where people are eating out of dumpsters. I mean, it's that
Right.
that's a
Right.
great point.
And North Korea, 40 miles away in the same peninsula, you have South Korea, which is a booming economy
Yeah.
with wealthy, happy, productive people with plenty of food.
Yeah, a great point.
The same demographics, the same language. They have, they do allow Christianity in South Korea. That's one difference, but they have freedom. They have
Right.
economic and political freedom, and they're not starving.
No, they're not. They're in fact quite the opposite.
Virtually the same climate and resources as North Korea.
And by the way, if you look at your average Korean, I mean, there's a discernible difference in size, height, weight. I mean, just due to diet. This speaks to a broader issue, and I would love your thoughts on this. Right, this is something that I have as an observer of the human race. I've thought about this and believe this for a very long time. These people, particularly these ones, call them oligarchs, who actually, and this is, I believe this whole thing's a power grab.
Yes.
And the ones
they
who
feel
are
so inadequate because of their lack of religion. They have that.
That's where I was going. That's exactly where I was going. You take God out of the equation because traditionally we had a God who made demands of us, right? Which is and that same God was responsible for Western civilization being the greatest civilization ever, and that is not particularly enjoyable or comfortable. And so after we depart from that, we create our own religion. Can you speak to that?
Yes, and what they need meaning in their lives, and they need to feel significant, and they also want to feel powerful. And so therefore, and the more people you can control, the more powerful. Of course, they will never be satisfied. Just like I don't believe the leader of North Korea is a happy person.
Right.
Though he has absolute power. But these people, I mean, these people, they have the power of life and death, and it's still not enough because, as you said before, there's a God-sized hole inside of us. Our hearts are restless until we rest in thee, says Augustine. And,
Yes.
and when you don't have the consolation of an afterlife or the consolation of the feeling that you've done the right thing, of your conscience in this life, and also the a really horrible thing about their worldview is that they don't have the redemptive value of suffering. They don't believe
Great point.
died to save us, but also they don't believe that. I mean, in Christianity, we teach that human suffering can be turned to the good, and that we. B.F. Skinner said there's no learning without pain, even if it's only the pain of boredom. We actually learn from our suffering. It's like every animal that can feel pain actually lives longer because
Great
it
point.
avoids those areas of pain. And by but these utopianists, they believe it has to be perfection or nothing, and that if your life has any suffering, it would be you'd be better off dead. They kill, like in Iceland, they kill every child with Down syndrome, feeling like if their life is, they abort them before they're born, but they feel like their life is meaningless if it has this amount of suffering. And I'm not even talking about I mean, they're pro suicide, they're pro um, infanticide of children who have birth defects.
Yeah,
And I mean,
terrifying.
sometimes your birth defect is being female in certain cultures.
Yeah, like China.
And
Yeah,
again, that it leads to they have a very distorted population. They have many more young men than young women because of their cultural preference for boys. And I think that not accepting, all this boils down to, you don't want to accept the world as it is. You want to change the climate. You're claiming the climate change on you. No, the climate was always changing. You just
sure.
want to accept the laws of you want to repeal the carbon cycle. You want to say that there are more than two sexes. There are not more than two sexes.
Yes, that's right.
Very, very rare anomaly of a hermaphrodite. And even if you get surgery, every cell in your body knows
Yeah,
what sex you started as. And I think it's sad that if someone is unhappy,
right.
we rush to surgery, whether it be abortion or a sex change surgery. Surgery is not the answer to psychological problems.
Good point. And it's interesting because we all know that well, anyone I think is intelligent knows that gender is not a social construct; it's a biological fact.
Right.
And so we're living in an era where we've absolutely removed God from the discussion, where that's God is actually literally dismissed as some sort of superstition, and we know what's better. And what's fascinating is that the I'll call it the oligarchs, the usual suspects. They've tapped in on one thing that is as old as time as itself. People don't want freedom. They don't. They people would rather sell their freedom for the illusion of security all day long. I mean, go back to the caveman, and whatever you always relied on the alpha animal. And so, if someone will say, hey, we've got this system for you here, and that's what the Great Reset's all about. Okay, the Great Reset out of the World Economic Forum in Davos. Justin Trudeau in Canada is on board with this. Prince Charles came out in favor of it. Merkel and Macron in Europe, John Kerry, and this is all about we are going to use the. And they even said they were going to use COVID. There's a lot of parallels between climate change and COVID, right? That since we've thrown out God, we're willing to hand over our entire lives and our freedoms for these people who are going to, absent of redemptive suffering, are going to tell us that they're going to carry us through this. We're not going to put our faith in God anymore. We're going to put our faith in these systems that all you have to do is hand over some of your freedom and also some of your tax money, which that's another story, and give it over to these people who know better, and it's void of
Yes.
God. And yeah, go ahead.
I often find that these people almost always know less than I do. they don't they don't want to talk about facts or data ever, because that, I mean, you said they dismiss religion as a superstition, yet they're willing to believe in fantasies.
Great point.
They talk about, for instance, with abortion, they say, well, early abortion, you could do that because the child doesn't have a personality yet.
It's not a
That's
sentient being.
that's
Okay.
just an ensoulment argument. Personality is their word for soul.
Yes.
It's just an ensoulment argument, but of course we know that you can't, the soul does not gradually evolve. It's there from the beginning.
Sure.
But even if that's just a belief, you can't just call it personality and say, oh, I'm enshrining my belief. That's, I worry a lot because education has been so corrupted.
It's been thoroughly corrupted, and frankly, let's look at this for a fact, right? The education has been corrupted. Let's talk about the primary and secondary level. The teachers' union refuses to go back to work because of the possibility of being, children dying and them dying. It's totally void of the data. I mean, this is what's happened. Like the chance
There's
of
no, I mean, the child has a far greater chance of dying of the average flu
than COVID.
than COVID. I mean, that one big difference between the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918-19 and this one is that young people died of that.
Yes.
There are some young people who died from this pandemic, but they were mostly, and some of the older people were people like Herman Cain who had cancer. Well, of course, you're immune compromised if you've been taking anti-cancer drugs. Uh, there were other people, but for instance, my mother died in November, and I was not able to see her for the last year of her life because of this, the restrictions that were put on us. And
Oh, so sorry. This was recent.
99% of people survive this disease, and yet it was presented. I mean, Andrew Cuomo said the virus is death. No, it's a virus. It's a survivable virus. And if people had been allowed to use more of the effective treatments earlier,
Yes.
it would have been even more survivable. And locking people away caused many other, I mean, it's the unforeseen consequences, like the rise in suicide, the rise in
Alcoholism, relapses, things like that. Yeah, this
uh,
is very real.
overweight. Whereas the, other than age, the second most common indicator that the virus will cause you problems is to be overweight.
Yes.
Um, and so, but people not being able to get out and exercise in the northern areas where it's too cold to do stuff outside. That was very um, effective at being at keeping people from exercising.
Yeah, exactly. To build up the
But there,
natural immunity
there,
to
but
fight this.
the idea that there is an elite that knows better than we do,
Yes.
that again, they're calling it something different. They're calling it the science. It's basically their priesthood.
Yes, and let me stop you
People
there for a
are,
second. Hold on, Elise, because this is crazy to me. And whether it's COVID or climate change, and I want you to pick it up. And I think you're about to go there. So effectively, this is particularly diabolical. We're talking about the fact that they're saying follow the science. You're automatically dismissed. There's no discussion, right? And in reality, the science points to the exact opposite. Yet no one is calling them on this, and the ones that do are silenced or canceled. It's very nefarious.
right. It deleted, uh, you know,
Canceled.
canceled, or their publications are not allowed to be published if they're in the scientific area. Uh,
Yeah.
they get fired from their jobs. You teachers and coaches who want their students to be in school or who want them to practice without a mask. I heard of a running coach who was fired because he let his students run without a mask. They're outdoors. They're running. They're 30 feet from the nearest competitor.
Elise,
Crazy.
Elise, he was a track coach, and I want to say in a New England prep school, right? That was the guy, and I just saw that this morning. And the guy's going, look, I refuse to play into this insanity anymore. I've followed this. I've read up on the science. And let me tell you something. The guy actually put a mask on and he ran the 100 and 200 yard. And he said, literally, the mask he was sucking it into his mouth. It was absolutely dangerous. And he just said, I refuse to play this anymore. This is ridiculous. And he goes, I'm not making these kids wear a mask, and fire me. And they did. He got fired.
Well, we have to do what we can to protect our children against the disinformation that's coming down. I mean, I think unplugging from standard media is important. And I don't think the standard media realizes the extent to which they've lost the next generation. My children would never even remotely consider watching the broadcast news, PBS, NPR, as well as the commercial stations. They don't realize that they have alienated that generation because people recognize it as propaganda.
Yes, that's right.
Just like people in Eastern Europe, and so the old Soviet Union,
Pravda.
They recognized that was not the truth. I mean, that's why Michael Novak's book, The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, was passed from hand to hand. This is the book that explains why capitalism can be justified in a Christian context.
Yes.
It was translated into all those Eastern European languages and passed from hand to hand when it was banned there. People wanted the truth, and people had hunger for it, so they found ways of getting it, but it didn't mean they believed the system. The system can do a lot of harm, though. I mean, this idea of firing people or canceling people who are misgendering people or canceling people who are so-called climate deniers. No,
Yes.
actually a person who studied this since the 1980s. And I wrote, I read many papers, wrote papers, and I don't want to be told by someone with no data and no experience and no understanding that because my ideas are not politically popular. What my ideas do not do is give them political power.
That's right.
My ideas empower the individual and the individual conscience. And if you have to repeat certain vows to become a teacher or a professor, that's not freedom of speech. That's not education, it's indoctrination.
That's exactly the distinction. Let me ask you something. I don't know what your opinion is on this, but have you ever seen a period in time where there was so much of this, where the casualty was the truth and absolutely silence, but at such magnitude as a percentage of the population? Because it's that serious. Was there ever a period of time where it was this bad?
I think in the Eastern Bloc for those 70 years.
No question about it. But from the people who say to represent freedom of speech, and on the Eastern country, it was totalitarian. They serve as a great example. But from a standpoint of, as Solzhenitsyn had warned us about this when he spoke at Harvard in May of 1978.
Yes.
Right, and that we were losing our soul. Right, and he talked about this quite eloquently. And of course, after that, he was no longer the darling of the media, and he was basically silenced. He was persona non grata.
He was really against consumerism and consumption.
Yes,
among other things. I mean, he said we can't use our freedom just to amass things.
Yes, and buy more Coca-Cola and houses. But his point was, I don't think there's ever been a time when you have to take out the Soviet bloc countries because they in a sense for this argument, but from a standpoint of supposedly a free society, right? Where
Well,
arguably that's new. That's a new concept.
There were certain concepts that the elite believed, and you were shunned for not believing. There
Okay.
were two from the early 20th century. They were absolutely false. One was eugenics.
Oh, great example.
Woodrow Wilson, Margaret
Sure.
Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood. Woodrow Wilson, president, but before that, president of Princeton.
Yes.
Academic, a PhD. And he believed that there were elites and that we should, I mean, he was a racist from the get-go.
Wait, what a great example, Dr. Rose.
So he believed that certain races were superior to others, and so did Margaret Sanger. And she believed that we should sterilize and exterminate.
No doubt.
She didn't consider favored. I mean, but in her case, I know more about her personal life than I do. In her case, she had a very sad personal life, and she blamed the fact that her mother had 10 children on that. So her idea was to eliminate the people instead of eliminate the problems that her mother had. And she was not a good person in her own personal life. I mean, she was promiscuous, she had affairs with a lot of married men. She was never happy, though.
Yes, and she was never happy, and also, and I think you're right. I think she targeted other people.
Going about it this way did not, I mean, when you're little or maybe a teenager and you're mad at somebody, you say, "Oh, life would be better if that person didn't exist."
Right.
But a rational person, but also an empathetic person, can see it. That person has desires and hopes and wants a life just like I do. So to eliminate that person is not going to solve the problem. That's why we can't just say, "Oh, we have to reduce the population." Each one of those is a human being.
Absolutely.
Each one of those has an innate value. And if its value is not apparent to me, that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And if my idea doesn't agree with yours, it doesn't mean it doesn't have some value. But I think
agreed.
The other thing, and people are astonished when I tell them this is that belief in fairies and spiritualism was extremely common in the late 19th, early 20th century. Educated people, Arthur Conan Doyle,
sure,
wrote the Sherlock Holmes books, was convinced that fairies existed. And it was all kinds of so-called proof of this. Oh, there were lights in the garden and, that kind of thing.
Sure.
It took, and the belief in that you could contact the spirit world through mediums, that was very common in the teens and 20s of the 20th century. And, now we consider it frivolous and stupid, but it was very common then. Belief in astrology, which is based on false astronomy. They got the astronomy wrong, that all of astrology is based on. That's still really common, even in Europe where they're above religion. But they're not above astrology.
Yeah, and they're the same ones who are going to psychics and reading tea leaves and all that
right.
stuff. I spent a lot of time there.
Everybody has a longing for the transcendental.
That's right.
Life.
Dr. Rose,
we get there from several ways. Religion is one way, art is one way, and sometimes those are combined. But if we deny that, then we'll put something in there. In this case, scientism, where we have these false scientists. I mean, people like, if you look at Dr. Fauci, he was wrong in the AIDS epidemic. Why would we trust him now? I mean, he believes it's okay to have sex with strangers.
I know he's absolute.
That's not dangerous. But it's dangerous to go outdoors without 2 masks.
He's a classic example. His arrogance, and he was actually schooled by the Jesuits, who said that.
Highest paid member of the U.S. government. He gets a better salary than the president.
Unbelievable. Doctor, we're going to leave this here, but I want to thank you. First of all, will you come back? Because I can't thank you enough. You were
Yes.
tremendous. That would be wonderful. I just wanted to thank Dr. Elise Rose, who was good enough to, who has an extensive background actually in exactly this subject, climate change, and it was really enlightening. I just find, we certainly agreed that there is something going on here. If, at the very least, the real discussion and debate of ideas has been murdered. And, but we're gonna say our goodbye from the Lepanto Institute. But before we go, I just want to say we can't do this without folks like you. If you are so inclined, and you could put a certain portion of your money that you donate to the Lepanto Institute, please go to www.lepantoin.org/donate. And also, if you can, please check out our gift store, Lepanto Catholic Gifts, where we have a beautiful Sacred Heart cross that we're selling right now. Remember, Mother's Day is coming up, so it would be an excellent gift. It's beautiful, solid sterling silver. We also have some devotional decals in there that we're selling, some Lepanto wear, T-shirts, mugs, and lastly, the Rosary dog leash developed by Sarah Quinones out in Wisconsin. And we want to
I know
help
her.
all the. Yeah, she's great. She's absolutely great. And a lot of we want to help the people who are in the fight with us. And anyway, it's been great, Doctor. Thank you again. I just want to thank you and say goodbye again from the Lepanto Institute. This is General Quarters. Until next time, folks. See you then. Bye bye.